Welcome to the second installation of Sewing with Sir Mari. Today we're going to be making a puncture-proof hood to go under our fencing masks. We will be expounding upon the information that you learned in doing a single layer hood and using that to now create a hood that can go under our masks, be puncture-proof, and hopefully protect us from injury. This is my basic fencing hood. It is a two-piece hood without any gussets or gores, and it is made of 3 layers. It is made of a layer of densely woven cotton, an interlayer of denim, which is puncture-proof, and then a lining layer. In this hood specifically, the outer fabric and the lining layer are actually the exact same cotton. My fancier hood is made of a heavyweight denim and is lined with a different color fabric, which is a light cotton that helps to absorb sweat. Once again, we are going to start our pattern on our sheet so that we have some patterning material that we can play with. I'm double layering it so that I can make an actual hood out of the sheet to fit onto my head, just like we did with our single layer hood. Again, we're using the hoodie as a basis so that you can see how much you may want to add. Now, if your head's very small and your hoodies are huge on you, this hood size might be fine. If your head's very large and the hoodie never fits, you want to add extra. You can see that we're not actually that much bigger than the hoodie. We have seam allowance added in pretty much around and just giving us a little bit more of a rounding. The front dips down because I prefer under my fencing mask to not have this stick up and then get crushed. So instead, I give it a little bit of a slope, and that brings in that nice tight around my face. Because we're pulling this over our head, we need to make sure the distance across here is at minimum our head width so that we can pull it over our head, remembering that often you're going to be pulling it over your head when you're sweaty, and you don't want to have it caught on your head and then have it be unable to come off easily, especially if you are claustrophobic. This has just a small mantle. Mostly the mantle is there just to be able to tuck this all underneath the gorget so that no skin shows. It also helps if you have a fencing coat or a shirt without a collar, because this will then overlap that and prevent you from having extra skin exposed. By overlaying the pattern that I use for my fencing hood over the top of the hood that we made for the single layer hood, you can see that the single layer hood tends to be quite a bit higher because we want the drape around the face. In our fencing hood, we actually want this to be closer to our head. So this opening is much similar to the hoodie versus our hood itself. You can see where this is much higher here. So if you're using your hoodie as your basis for this, you will see that it is very different than when we gave the extra measurements for the single layer hood. Bearing in mind that if you make your pattern too big, you can always cut it down in the fitting process. It is better to add a little extra than to have it be a little small. So in this case, I'm going to add an extra 1.5 inches or so to the face, again having this dip down. I'm going to add a good seam allowance around all the outside and a little bit of extra room here in the back of the head, although it may come back out with fitting, but I like having this little bit of extra rounded because I'm wearing my hair bundled up underneath here. Then at the neckline, this is where I'm going to have this flare out. And if you feel that on your other hood that you didn't have enough room here, you can flare that out a little bit more. And then I'm having this just kind of dip down. The face, I'm actually ending just a little short of this, although you could make it a little longer depending on how you want this to fit on top of your head. I find that this distance works well for me, and I will run through the numbers and measurements of what this pattern is for your benefit after we look at this. and then this flares out to come up over the chest. Here are the basic measurements that the pattern I use actually are. So the entirety from the top to the base is 20 inches. Our cross piece across from where it bends at the back of the neck to where it bends at the front of the hood, minus the seam allowance, is 11.5, meaning that 23 inches is going to be that distance. If your head is bigger than 23 inches, add a little extra space. The face opening is approximately 10.5, a little extra for the curve, but from the top of this to here is 10.5. Each of my flares are 5, and from this cross piece to the tip of my shoulder is about 8.5. Bearing in mind this is your pattern, and you can alter it later, go wild, have a good time with this, and then when we do a fitting, you'll be able to see what needs to be changed. I'm going to cut this guy out, and then we will sew up this back line, and then down this front. And until we get to the finishing, that's all the sewing that needs to be done for now. I'm going to go ahead and sew the hood now. In the previous video of the one-layer hood, I went over the sewing machine and its various features and how to make it function. So if you have questions about that, you should check out that in our one-layer hood video. So this is the face of the hood here, and this is the front of the chest. I'm going to sew those together. I know that I want to sew from this point to here. I like to use a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters or 15 mil. Which is indicated right here on my machine. I find that this gives me extra room to manipulate the fabric if I need to later on, and it's not too wide as to cause difficulties. So it's a good middle ground for me. I'm going to remove my pin so that I don't wind up breaking a needle. Go back. I have my stitch length on 3. I have a straight stitch, and I'm ready to go. When I get to the base of where I want to stitch, I will back it up to lock it in place and go forward. And then I want to raise my needle and to raise this to the top so that when I take off again, I do not wind up pulling my thread out of my needle. And also it allows the bobbin to spin freely so that I can pull my threads out. Now I'm going to sew the entirety of the back of this hood. So from the top all the way around, and I can pin all that in place so that it doesn't shift. For this one, if you're using this as your pattern and you think you may need to change, go to the biggest stitch length that you have available. That way, if you need to pull all of this out later, it makes it simple. Just remember, on our actual fashion fabric, we'll be reducing our stitch length. Here it is stitched together. Here around the top and the back, and down the front. Now our next step is to try it on and to see if it's going to fit the way that I want it to fit. So here is the hood with the seam allowance out, and for the most part it fits pretty much like I expect. It has a good distance over the shoulders, it has a good distance down the chest, it has a good distance in the back. The face is a little bit tighter than I think I would like it to be. However, you must remember that there's going to be a seam allowance taken up, so however far back your seam allowance goes depends on how far that's going to be rolled. Even with that, I think that right here this interferes with my peripheral vision, and I think having it go back further would be good. So I'm going to mark it right here so I can adjust that once I take it off. Other than that, my head slipped through it very nicely. I didn't have a lot of extra tension pulling my head through, so I'm happy with that. It is going to be 3 layers, and one of those layers is going to be fairly stiff. So if I feel that it is tight right now, I may want to give it a little bit more room just to allow for that later. When choosing your material, not only do you need to consider the density of it, and if it is puncture proof or not, and if it's going to hold up for our purposes, as well as, of course, the fashion considerations of the color and what it's going to look like and how it drapes. But the other thing that we look at is how wide it is, because that's going to make a difference on how much you need to get. If you notice the green, which is folded in half so that we can cut 2 layers at once, that's 112 centimeters or 43 inches. However, the dark material is 169 centimeters or 66 inches, and it's also folded. With our pattern, if I was laying it out on the green fabric instead of the blue, you can see that I can get 1 pattern piece per distance of it, and this is approximately 21 inches long, so about 60 centimeters, give or take, that I'm going to need for each layer if I'm using the green as my material for the outside and or the inside. So if I have about 60 centimeters, then I should have plenty for just doing 1 layer, cutting both sides. If instead I use my wider material, you can see that I can nest my pattern in and take up a lot less material in the length of it. So whereas on my green, they were taking up about 54 centimeters, I rounded up to 60, but about 54 centimeters from top to bottom, and I could only put 1 per panel. If I have enough material to nest them, now it takes up only 27 inches or 69 centimeters. So really, for the added benefit of 6 inches, I can add an entire another panel, providing my material is wide enough. I want to make certain that I am running this along the grain line though, and my grain line runs true to this. So this needs to go up and down either the warp of the fabric, which the selvage edge indicates this would be the warp, or the weft. They can turn the other direction and fit into there also. But you can see that if I'm either doing this as 2 layers of the same material, which I will be doing for this hood, or if I'm making multiple hoods, that having the wider fabric allows me a lot more freedom. So when you're looking at your fabric, that is definitely something to consider. So now I have 3 layers. I have my outer layer, I have my interlining, which will go between the 2 layers, that is puncture proof, and I have the lining that will be next to my skin. I've already had this material puncture proofed, and I know that at 1 layer it passes puncture resistance. The same thing with the denim that I use, that after it is washed, I know that it also will pass the puncture proof resistance test. And I had this test before I made it into a garment. This will assist you because it's very frustrating to make this entire garment up and then have it puncture tested and to find out it fails. I would recommend, after having washed and dried all your fabric before cutting it, if you're ever going to wash this again, and being that it's a fencing hood, I would recommend that, is to take your 3 layers and put them together and let one of the marshals test it on the puncture resistant apparatus so that you know that it is now puncture resistant. That is considered to be good for 2 years, and then it needs to be tested again. If you're going to make up a swatch that has these materials in them, so you don't have to necessarily have holes in your garment, then that also needs to be washed with this and worn with it. For our fencing coats, I have a swatch of material that lives in the back of the coat. It is actually whip stitched in so that it gets washed just as often as the coat does, and also it gets worn just as much as the coat does. So far, on our 4 years of testing it, it's passed with flying colors because it has the denim on the inside. That concludes part 1 of our 2-part video on how to construct a fencing hood. Please tune in for our second half, where we will go over how to sew it together and the order of operations.